Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of Welcome to Geek Town. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider to be the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here, you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Before we get started on this week's episodes, just a couple of quick calls to action. I'd love to get this podcast heard by more people, and one of the ways that can be done is by having enough reviews on iTunes to actually have it show up when people look at the best reviewed podcasts in my category. I'm still a couple of reviews short of that, so if you could drop into iTunes and leave a 5-star review, that would be very helpful. Secondly, there's another way you can help support me directly. The Radio Public app is a great way to follow all of your podcasts. And if you listen to Welcome to Geektown using that app, I get a little bit of money to help keep the podcast running and even make improvements down the line. The Radio Public app is available for both iOS and Android. I'll also include a link on my website, welcometogeektown, that's the number 2.com. Thanks! Our question this time comes from Matt S., who has a question about a character who will be appearing on film in just a few months. He asks simply, who is Carol Danvers? Well, Matt, while that's a very straightforward question, due to her 50 years of publishing history, the answer will be a little more complex. But let's work our way through it together and learn some about the main character of the upcoming Captain Marvel movie. For the spoiler sensitive, I will be mostly talking about the comics, up to and including an issue that came out just last Wednesday as I'm writing this. A little over a week ago if you're listening as soon as the podcast is released. I also will reference lines and scenes from the trailer that was released last week. If that's going to bother you, feel free to come back to this episode after the movie is released in March. As for the rest of us, let's get started. While Carol now uses the superhero identity of Captain Marvel, she was not the first in the Marvel Universe to claim that title. Actually, there were two heroes whose stories were published by other companies that also went by that name, but we'll ignore them for now, as that could be an entirely separate episode. The original Captain Marvel was actually Captain Mar-Vell, a member of the Kree Imperial Militia sent to Earth to observe and spy on the humans to find out if they are or could be a threat. For those only familiar with the Marvel movies and TV, the Kree are the blue-skinned aliens seen in Guardians of the Galaxy as well as in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Mar-Vell took on the guise of a recently deceased scientist in order to work for NASA as part of his cover. He got his superhero identity when he first used his alien abilities, and the people he rescued understandably misheard his name Mar-Vell as Marvel. His adventures continued from 1967, when he first appeared, until 1982, when he died of cancer in Marvel's first large-sized original graphic novel, aptly titled The Death of Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel holds the distinction of being one of the few superhero characters to have died and never been resurrected, although there have been a couple of fake-outs that led us to believe he might have returned. 3 other characters held the Captain Marvel title after the original, but before Carol. 2 of them, Janice Vell and Phyla Vell, were brother and sister and are the children of Mar-Vell. Although this being comics, their stories involve cloning, genetic engineering, and alternate timelines. Since they're not the main subject of Matt's question, we'll move on. The last Captain Marvel we'll talk about before we get back to Carol is Monica Rambeau. A police lieutenant from New Orleans, exposed to extra-dimensional energy, she gained the ability to convert her body into any type of energy on the electromagnetic spectrum, including light, X-rays, infrared, and so on. She is actually the only character to hold the Captain Marvel name who had no relationship to the original Captain Marvel. She's changed her superhero identity a number of times to avoid doubling up codenames, using Photon, Pulsar, and most recently, Spectrum. Finally, that brings us back to Carol. Other than the original Kree Captain Marvel, Carol is the oldest of the characters to bear this name. She first appeared in Captain Marvel's second published story in a book simply titled Marvel Superheroes No. 13. Carol was a former Air Force pilot who now served as the head of security for the NASA base that Captain Mar-Vell worked at in his stolen human identity. Carol herself never had any powers that we knew of until almost a decade later. In Captain Marvel No. 18, Carol was rescued by Captain Marvel from an exploding Kree device called the Psyche Magnetron. Apparently, the resulting energy flowing through Mar-Vell as he shielded Carol from the explosion changed her DNA to half human and half Kree, granting her similar powers to Captain Marvel himself, which she later used to become the hero known as Ms. Marvel. Those powers include superhuman strength, endurance, and stamina, as well as flight and a limited precognitive seventh sense. That's what they called it in the book. Why it wasn't a sixth sense, I don't understand, but apparently it's one better. Ms. Marvel No. 1, published in 1977, was the first time we see Carol use her abilities, although there was a twist. At first, Carol was completely unaware of her time as Ms. Marvel, as she would black out before changing into the superhero. Eventually, she became aware of her alternate identity, and in Ms. Marvel No. 18, the two became one, and now Carol had access to her powers at all times. However, that status quo was not to last. After her solo title was cancelled, Ms. Marvel briefly joined the Avengers. However, this resulted in one of the flat-out worst stories to ever be foisted onto a character. Long story short, in Avengers No. 200, Carol found herself suddenly pregnant. Like, ready to give birth in one day suddenly. The rest of the Avengers reacted to this with joy and anticipation of the new arrival, despite Carol not knowing how this happened and saying after giving birth, quote, "I feel used. That isn't my baby. I don't even know who the father is." The baby grows into an adult as quickly as it first appeared, revealing himself to be Marcus, the son of Immortus, who was trapped in the alternate dimension known as Limbo. For reasons, he could not leave Limbo and go to Earth in his current state. So he used his technology to abscond Carol, who was a dead ringer for his dead mother, woo her with, and I quote, "a subtle boost from Immortus's machines," said machines having been used by Immortus to mind control Marcus's mother when he wanted a mate. Then, impregnate her with what would basically be a clone of himself, and finally return her with no memory of the encounter. Upon learning this, Carol decides to go off with Marcus back to Limbo to live. The Avengers send her off with congratulations and hopes for a happily ever after ending. Now, I could spend another 20 minutes or more going off on everything wrong with this story, but it has been covered by many others. I will have a link at my website to Carol A. Strickland's 1980 essay, The Rape of Miss Marvel, originally published in LOC magazine and probably the best-known piece on the subject. Moving on, Carol's next appearance was 1 year later in Avengers Annual number 10, where writer Chris Claremont took the Avengers to task for their callousness and lack of self-awareness in the Marcus storyline. This issue is better known as the first appearance of Rogue, who used her powers to permanently absorb Carol's powers and memories. Professor X of the X-Men was able to restore Carol's memories to her, but she lost much of the emotional connection to said memories, and remained unpowered for another year. Claremont made Carol one of the X-Men's allies, and she appeared in their book off and on, eventually getting new powers while in space with the X-Men, after being experimented on by the Brood, an alien race who actually somewhat resembles the aliens in the movie franchise bearing that name. With her new powers tapping into the energy of a white hole, apparently the opposite of a black hole, she went by the name Binary. Although she eventually lost her connection to the source of her energy projection powers, she can still absorb energy and redirect it in thanks to this experimentation, while also regaining her suite of powers she got from Captain Marvel. In the trailer, we see her shoot a blast of energy from her hands, so it's likely that she will have the energy absorption powers she got while being Binary, although I think it's unlikely that she will have gotten them from a different source than her other abilities in the film. Carol spent much of her time in space while she was Binary, but eventually found her way back to Earth and at one point rejoined the Avengers. During this period of time, having lost the Binary powers as I mentioned earlier, she switched her codename to Warbird. In a storyline written by Kurt Busiek, Carol was revealed to have issues with alcohol, using it to dull the pain of her memory issues, as well as the loss of her cosmic-level powers. When she showed up to a superhero battle drunk, Iron Man, a recovering alcoholic himself, was finally able to get through to Carol in order for her to get help and start the recovery process. We still occasionally see her in an AA meeting or otherwise referencing her sobriety, so this has become an important part of her character. I think the first movie will be a little too busy with other aspects to focus on this, but it could be an interesting story to tell in a sequel, especially since Iron Man never really got his Demon in a Bottle storyline adapted to the screen. The Avengers team that Warbird was a part of disbanded during the Avengers Disassembled storyline that was a build-up to the House of M story. I've talked about House of M on a few other Marvel-centric episodes, so I won't go over it again in detail here, but it was during House of M that Carol first took on the Captain Marvel codename, as her wish to be an accepted part of the superhero world was granted, and she was the most popular non-mutant hero in that alternate world. After House of M ended, Carol retained much of her memory of that time, and used it to motivate herself to become a more trusted and dependable part of the superhero community. She returned to the Ms. Marvel codename during this time, helping Tony Stark during Civil War, joining and eventually leading the Mighty Avengers, and playing a significant role in the Secret Invasion. The main villains of Secret Invasion are the shape-shifting aliens called Skrulls, and they will also be playing a role in the Captain Marvel movie, so aspects of that story may show up in the upcoming film. Carol finally accepted the mantle of Captain Marvel in the regular Marvel Universe in 2012, in stories mostly written by Kelly Sue DeConnick. It was during this run that Carol had her third issue with memories, as doctors found a structure in her brain that put her at risk of a hemorrhage whenever she used her powers. Since she was unwilling to give up being a hero, this did eventually happen. Her half-Kree DNA healed her, but she again lost years of memories. But since then, she's continued to come back stronger than ever, and has been part of the Avengers, the Ultimates, an all-female team called A-Force, the Guardians of the Galaxy, and has led the agency known as SWORD, which is dedicated to keeping Earth safe from extraterrestrial threats. She's now considered to be one of the leading heroes in the Marvel Universe, and was even one of the leaders of the two sides in the Civil War II storyline, a spiritual successor rather than a direct sequel to the more well-known Civil War miniseries. A running theme you may have noticed in this was Carol having issues with memories, either losing them or not being able to remember her time as Ms. Marvel when she first started her superheroic career. Judging from the line in the trailer,
I keep having these memories. I see flashes. I think I had a life here.
this will probably be an important aspect of her character in the film, as it has been in the comics. Now, all of these stories that I've talked about, and more, may have an influence on the upcoming movie, but it appears a new comic story actually may go the other way. Right now, Carol is starring in a miniseries called The Life of Captain Marvel, where she visits home for the first time in quite a while. Having lost much of her childhood memory, and having little emotional connection to the memories she does have, her biological family has not been a large part of her story. However, in the latest issue, we discover that her family was more than they appeared. If the last page reveal is true in issue number 3, Carol's mother actually is a Kree. So the Psychomagnetron didn't so much grant her powers as release her true heritage. It's a retcon of her origin, but one that simplifies things so that the original Captain Marvel is no longer necessary to explaining her powers. Since the powers that be at Marvel are saying that the new movie will not be a quote-unquote origin movie, they'll want the explanation for her powers to be as simple as possible. And just saying, Mom's a Kree, Dad's a human, is a lot easier than was near a Kree disguised as a human when a machine exploded, merging his DNA into mine. So, that's Carol Danvers in a reasonably sized nutshell. Is there anything out there that you want to add, or do you have other questions that this raised for you? Let me know by sending an email to me at welcometogeektown@gmail.com, or leave a comment directly on the show notes at www.welcometogeektown.com. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and give me a 5-star review over on iTunes to join the Geektown City Council to help other people find the show so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.